Hello and welcome to this SHRA Masterclass. My name's David Pierpoint. I'm the Chief Executive of the Retrofit Academy Community Interest Company. More about us in a moment. This Masterclass focuses on the role of a Retrofit Coordinator under British Standard BSI PAS 2035. Before we get stuck into that, just a little bit about the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator and the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. These are programs here to kickstart social housing retrofits. You probably by now are aware that £160 million has been made available through the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund to kickstart some large-scale retrofit in social housing. And the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator is a program designed to support people who are putting forwards and developing bids into that program. So for more information about that, please visit the SHRA website. There's a link to that at the end of the session. There's me. It's very nice to meet you. I am always happy to talk to anybody about retrofit, and if you'd like to do that, my contact details are on screen. You can see I'm involved in many things to do with retrofit, both in terms of delivering training through the Retrofit Academy. We also provide consultancy and support to social landlords and local authorities in developing retrofit strategy and delivering retrofit projects. And we'll also be working as part of the SHRA team. As I say, very happy to talk about retrofit in any aspect of it with any of you anytime. In terms of what we're going to cover today, I'm going to do a quick recap on PAS 2035 itself. Some of you may have already seen my presentation on PAS 2035, which goes into a lot more detail, but I'll be sort of just revisiting elements of that to bring you all onto the same page. I'll then go into talk about the role of the Retrofit Coordinator specifically, and then we're going to finish by sharing some new information, some new evidence that we've gathered around how local authorities and housing associations can develop contracting models for PAS 2035, which covers the Retrofit Coordinator, but also all the other roles too. So without further ado, we're just going to remind you of the 6 stages of PAS 2035. So the PAS is a 90-page, densely packed booklet, and it's a pretty tough read. You don't need to know every element of it at all. That's really down to your supply chain to know the ins and outs of it. But what you as intelligent clients need to know is what I'm about to tell you. So we break the PAS down into 6 steps. This is the process of delivering a retrofit project, which is the key to PAS 2035. Now, step 1 is identifying the intended outcomes of a project. So sitting down with a client or residents at the beginning and saying, we're going to spend some money on a retrofit, and we really want to work out what outcomes we're looking to achieve through that. So it could be saving a certain amount of carbon, it could be reducing heating bills, it could be improving indoor air quality. Just as when we buy anything, particularly expensive items, it's about identifying what we're looking to get out of that purchase, out of that investment. Is carrying out a risk assessment, ensuring that we're going to manage this project in an appropriate way. Retrofit is an inherently risky business, particularly if not a sensible process like this isn't observed. So it's down to the Retrofit Coordinator to conduct that risk assessment. Step 3 is the dwelling assessment. This is where we send a professional and qualified individual into a property in order to gather lots of data about it and then provide that data so that sensible decisions can be made that are appropriate for that property and its owner and residents. Step 4 is where the Retrofit Coordinator really comes into their own, planning and design. This involves creating medium-term retrofit plans and improvement option evaluation and commissioning appropriate design for that project. Step 5 is all about installation and handover. So this is doing it. This is installing the stuff. In previous retrofit regimes, this is sort of where we started and stopped. So you can see here it's step 5, so it's almost at the end of the process. And step 6 is all about monitoring and evaluation. So making sure that what we said we set out to achieve in step 1, those intended outcomes have been delivered in reality, and ensuring that nothing has gone wrong and there are no unintended consequences. So please, if nothing else, take away from a session like this, those 6 simple steps. Make sure that your supply chain is observing those. Also make sure that this person here, our Retrofit Coordinator, we call her Joy, make sure that she is involved from before step 1 and after step 6. Her job is to project manage this retrofit from one end to the other, from cradle to grave. Don't allow anyone to tell you otherwise. If they are, that is not a PAS 2035 compliant project. You should by now be familiar with these roles that have been introduced by PAS 2035. You can see there on the right-hand side, our Retrofit Coordinator, probably the most important of these roles. We're going to go into detail about that today. But also important to understand the other individuals who will play a part. Bear in mind, though, that sometimes these individuals will fulfill multiple roles if they're appropriately qualified and accredited to do so. Very commonly, a retrofit coordinator will also be a qualified retrofit assessor, and a retrofit coordinator can act as a retrofit advisor. Retrofit coordinators often act, in fact, at the minute, only retrofit coordinators act as a retrofit evaluator. Retrofit coordinators who are also qualified designers often will fulfill that role too. So it's possible that a retrofit coordinator will fill up to 5 of those roles. It's pretty unlikely that they'll also be the installer, but it is possible that they will work for the same organization that is the installer. So there are different ways of skinning this, and the contracting models I'll come on to at the end do cover some ways in which you can approach that. The other thing the PAS does is it says we're going to have 3 risk paths, essentially low, medium and high, and then breaking our projects down into those 6 steps that we talked about before, it will identify who exactly can do what. So you can see the retrofit coordinator there, the symbol in strategy, which was the design and planning stage. They do that. They also overview all of the other stages, including the installation and handover stages, and they fulfill the monitoring and evaluation stage until such time as there is such a thing as a retrofit evaluator, which there isn't at the moment. Don't try and take this in now, albeit this is a helpful little guide we put together. This is available in something I'll signpost to you later. But important to know that you have to have these sort of round pegs in round holes. So the retrofit coordinator, what does the PAS say about their role? This is absolutely fundamental stuff. So it says that a retrofit coordinator is a person qualified as a specialist retrofit project manager, taking overall responsibility for overseeing the assessment of dwellings, the identification, specification and evaluation of energy efficiency measures for installation in accordance with PAS 2035. In other words, it's their job to oversee everything from the start to the finish, from the cradle to the grave. Now, there are quite a lot of providers out there at the minute who are offering retrospective retrofit coordinator services, so essentially checking that your projects have been done in a way that they would have found acceptable as retrofit coordinators, and I can assure you that is not compliant with the PAS, so please avoid it. The reason that's so important is that the retrofit coordinator's job is to be the individual who protects the client's interest and the public's interest. And again, that's a direct extract from PAS, section 6.13. The role of the retrofit coordinator shall be to protect both the client's interest and the public's interest. In social housing, you as social landlords are the client, and the public are your residents. So these are people there to protect you. If they don't do that, and bad things happen as a result of decisions that they make, and they haven't been made in your interest, they're not doing their job properly. So hold them to account and they'll soon fall into line. Now, there are a number of different types, shapes and sizes of retrofit coordinators. Here are 5 that we've identified. And what we see here from left to right is essentially, in general terms, an increasing conflict of interest. A retrofit coordinator employed by you as a housing association essentially has no real conflict of interest. It is possible, I suppose, but by and large, they should be on your side, and if they're not great employees. If they're independent, they're independent consultants, no vested interest, then that's probably the next best solution. They're employed by managing agents, people who oversee and manage scheme delivery on behalf of a social landlord. You know, again, increasing amounts of conflicts of interest, but they're manageable and doable if a sensible approach is taken. When you start to talk about a retrofit coordinator being employed by an installer, that's where we start to have some concerns, and we'd ask you to just be very cautious. The PAS does allow this, provided these conflicts of interest are declared, and they must be. And if they're not, again, that's not compliant with PAS 2035, so you can throw the book at them. The reason there's a conflict there is that installer will often have an interest in what measures are ultimately installed, as in, are they things that they do and are comfortable with and confident about and frankly make money out of. So there is an inherent conflict unless that is appropriately managed. Those measures may not be the right thing for that resident or you as a client at this point in time. And if the coordinator isn't sense checking that for you, you're going to have to be a very, very intelligent client yourself to make sure that it's right. And beyond that spectrum, there are these sign-off only. Now, in terms of conflicts of interest, it's sort of not applicable because it's not compliant. So again, tread carefully. Okay. We're going to look at cost models now. This is just very, very generalized. So what are the cheapest options and why might you consider options that are higher cost? So it's highly likely that coordinator services provided by installers will be the cheapest option. You're likely to find independent energy assessors who've upskilled to be retrofit coordinators. You're likely to be paying in the region of between £150 and £250 per day for their services. Research that we've done with those sorts of people indicates that they could do essentially two projects a day, 2 homes a day. So you might be looking at somewhere between £125 and £200 per job using those services. Working with people like architects who've qualified to become retrofit coordinators, you're looking at more professional base fees, upwards of £500, £450, £500. And on certain types of projects, particularly those involving protected or listed buildings, you might have to involve a retrofit coordinator who's a specialist consultant, and they tend to command much higher fees again. The sweet spot, we think, in the middle would be you as social landlords employ your own retrofit coordinators, having those people trained, whether with us or others, and providing that service on a totally impartial basis on an employee basis. So typically, a retrofit coordinator would probably expect to earn between £35,000 and £60,000 a year, depending on their previous experience. So not cheap, but a very good option. And then again, there's our friends, these sign-off services, very, very cheap. I think they're being offered for something about £75 per project. You'll derive no value from them other than potentially getting the odd one through the compliance process. But Trustmark and the like should be hammering down on that soon, so avoid it. Okay. We often hear that there aren't enough retrofit coordinators to deliver the projects that the government wants to deliver, and there's no doubt that there are challenges there, particularly when they launch schemes like the Green Home Grant at very short notice and without time for the supply chain to mature. We're not in that position with the SHDF programme, where we may be looking, I don't know, 50, 60 projects. I'm guessing it depends what comes forward. But do we have enough retrofit coordinators? The answer to that from our side is clearly yes. There are currently 320 accredited retrofit coordinators in the country. They are a subset of the 480 graduates that we have from our retrofit coordinator diploma. So that's our level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management, which is the qualification required if you want to become an accredited coordinator. So a good number, and we know from research with those people that actually there is plenty of capacity there. The best thing and this is a sort of a free offer to any social landlord, is we can help you find those people through the RetroBook service that we offer. This is free for social landlords and local authorities wanting to engage with retrofit coordinators, assessors and so on, local to them, and which the Retrofit Academy can vouch for. So that's a good option, and if you want to find out more, visit retrobook.co.uk. Okay, we're going to take a bit more of a deep dive into those, what a retrofit coordinator is going to do at each stage of a retrofit project, a PAS 2035 retrofit project. Starting with step 1, intended outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, this is very much about identifying the realities that we face in terms of budget and time scale, and also identifying what it is the client and resident want to achieve for this project. Now, on a SHDF program, you'll be dealing with likelihood is sort of 50, 70, maybe even 100 properties within a project. So the challenge you're going to have is, can you essentially identify one set of intended outcomes, or do you want to be a bit more nuanced than that? You might have different types of property, you might have different forms of lease and tenure. You will all have different challenges there. So the PAS requires a retrofit coordinator to generate a plan for each property. So it is sensible to have intended outcomes for each property, but on a large scale program like this, it's likely that they're going to look very similar to one another. So there's step 1. It's about goal setting, budget setting, and agreeing those intended outcomes. The next step in the process is the risk assessment. This is when we determine the way in which a project must be managed as laid out in PAS 2035. And this is a process that must always be undertaken by the retrofit coordinator. Can't be done by anybody else. There are people out there telling you that retrofit assessors can do this. That is not compliant with PAS 2035. The assessment process itself is not a complex one. You can see the table here, which is just extracted straight from PAS 2035. There are 5 criteria that must be assessed and a risk grade allocated under each. And the grade that ultimately you gives is the highest any of the assessed grades. So, for example, if the combination of measures was assessed as PAF C or high risk, that's a really bad example. I'll do criteria 2, the average number of improvement measures per dwelling. If that's more than 5, that must be assessed as a C. If all of the other criteria were an A, that would be assessed to be a PAS C project. So if any of those boxes have a high grade in a B or a C, it must be the highest individual grade that's applied. Now, once we've done that and we've allocated the project to PAF A, PAF B and PAF C, it's then down to the retrofit coordinator to lay out a project plan which is compliant with the PAS. And the rather scary looking flowchart that you see here, the color codings show you the way through on each pathway. Given on SHDF, you're going to be dealing with projects that are likely to have more than 30 properties in. The vast majority of your projects are highly likely to be PAF C. That is, by definition, the most onerous and the most strenuous path through. Using the ski slope analogy, the piste map analogy, these are your red slopes. These are the quite challenging slopes. And you're going to be needing to involve professional designers and good retrofit coordinators in those projects to ensure you get the right sorts of results. And that's what the PAS is there to ensure that you do, and that people don't cut corners. So it is clearly the route map is clearly laid out. You can see on this model that it involves a PAF C form of assessment. It will, if those buildings are either traditional or protected buildings. Traditional means pre-1919, protected means some form of conservation order or of a listing. You will have to carry out what's called a significance assessment. All of these pathways require ventilation assessment and so on and so forth. So it is rigorous and initially will be onerous, but you're soon going to get into the swing of it. The next step of our process is the dwelling assessment. Step 3, Importantly, this must be commissioned by the Retrofit Coordinator. It must be delivered as per their specification, which is driven as a minimum by the requirements of PAS 2035. Again, there are lots of people out there saying that these can be done, assessments can be commissioned by a retrofit assessor, and that is not compliant. So that specification from the coordinator lays out all those mandatory requirements, such as the significance assessment, the ventilation assessment. They may, if they deem it appropriate, they may require more by way of building testing from that. It's entirely at the discretion of the retrofit coordinator. There is far more involved in carrying out these assessments than you will be used to if you've conducted energy performance certificate assessments in the past. So they may take 20-30 minutes normally. Retrofit assessments, you can expect at least initially half a day, maybe even a full day per property. And the reason for that is it is about going below the surface and really understanding the pathology of that building and getting all the data from, if you like, behind the walls, under the floorboards and in the loft that you're going to need. Now, a very sensible approach with these things, particularly if you're dealing with one archetype or a small number of archetypes in your projects, is to commission very in-depth surveys and models on the first few properties that you do. Thereafter, the next 50 or 60 should really speed up, and you should be able to go into less depth because you're really just checking for the defects and for the variations, the things that have been done to those properties that weren't done to some of the others. So it will really speed up as you go, and ultimately they may only take an hour or two, but it will take some time to get there. Now, these assessments must be carried out by a qualified retrofit assessor. They must also be accredited with one of the retrofit assessor schemes in the same way as a coordinator must be. They must assess every dwelling. So you can't just do the archetype. You can't just say we've done one in depth and they're all the same. PAS 2035 does require you to assess every dwelling, and that includes every flat within a block of flats, including the common areas. Very importantly, the job of the retrofit assessor is to collect data. They are not allowed to provide advice to the homeowner. They're also not allowed to carry out the retrofit coordinators bits that I'm coming on to in a moment, unless they're also qualified and accredited as a retrofit coordinator. And when they've submitted their report to the coordinator, they must sign off that they are happy with what's been provided, everything has been done as per their request, and that they've got the data that they need to move on to the fun stuff. Here is an example of a retrofit assessment that's been conducted in software called Passive House Planning Package, PHPP, which is one of a number of different bits of software that can be used and we would sort of endorse and recommend. This is just to provide a contrast really with the level of data that you will get from an EPC survey, which will be very superficial, and it will use software which makes an awful lot of assumptions. We expect and retrofit demands really the sort of level of detail that you can see here in the PHPP model. This is on a property in Scotland. Okay, so moving on to the planning and design stage, step 4. There are 3 steps here. The first is to conduct an improvement option evaluation. The second is to create a medium-term plan, which must be agreed with the client. And the third is to ensure an appropriate design solution is identified for that property. So a little detail on these. The improvement option evaluation is essentially a spreadsheet which helps work out what the best measures to install will be. The reason that's so important, as well as identifying those measures, is deciding which combination of measures should be built into which packages. So in the example here that we have, it will, once we've chosen what measures we want to do, they are put into bundles which can be delivered in various different stages. Now with SHDF, you're going to have a budget of somewhere around 15, 20, 25,000 pounds, hopefully, per property. I believe those are the ranges. There are going to be lots of properties where that won't be sufficient to take the retrofit to its ultimate destination. It is going to be perhaps the first of several, or the first of a couple, at least, steps towards the full decarbonisation of that home. So we want to know about that bundling and what packages to put together. The improvement option evaluation, or IOE for short, evaluates things like the carbon cost effectiveness, the future fuel costs, the payback period on those measures, so when you'll get your investment back in effect, and they feed into our next key spreadsheet, which is called the medium-term retrofit plan. Now, this is a route to optimal retrofit. So if you like a building passport or a sort of a plan to get this property to as lower level of decarbonisation as it is feasible, realistic and practicable to do. It is a bespoke plan for that individual property. It will usually feature staged retrofit. So doing SHDF now, what does that leave us still to do before 2050, and when might we come back and do those things, which in a social housing context is almost always linked into your asset management strategy and the time horizons around that. So yep, 25-year time horizon is typical, and it will include those trigger points. In owner-occupied properties, these are often things like having babies or kids going to university, or the things that make us do things to our home. In social housing, it's far more about when we're planning to replace doors, windows, and replace roofs and stuff like that. When completed, these plans and the IOE must be lodged in the Trustmark data warehouse, and that means whoever owns or is responsible for that property in the future will be able to access those and pick up the plan at any given point in time. Step 5, the retrofit coordinator's job in step 5 is very much about oversight. They are not the individual responsible on site for managing the project, delivering the installation, and there are rare occasions where that will be the case. But the installer is accountable to the retrofit coordinator, not in terms of health and safety and site management, but in terms of sticking to the plan. So if the installer wants to make changes for whatever reason, those changes must be approved by the retrofit coordinator. Otherwise, it's not a compliant project. If they want to substitute one product for another, for whatever reason, they must get that signed off in writing by the coordinator. And that is because it's the coordinator's job to ensure PAS compliance, that the best things and the right things are being done for the homeowner, resident and clients. So if that installer is making changes for, let's say, for argument's sake, because they want to save a few bob, they cannot do that unless it's signed off by the coordinator, and that refers back to the conflict of interest questions that I raised earlier on. Okay, so on to our final stage, monitoring. In the current world of PAS 2035, retrofit coordinators are retrofit evaluators, and they conduct the monitoring and evaluation on their own projects. That forms usually takes the form of a simple questionnaire that is completed by the client, either you as the social landlord or you and the resident. And if the results of that survey come back and say everything's fine and nothing's gone wrong and there's no horrible hidden nasties, that would be the end of it. However, if it does identify problems, that must be handed over to an independent retrofit coordinator who will move it to the next step of monitoring and evaluation. So you sort of have that independence brought in. And if that stage doesn't sort things out, another retrofit coordinator or the retrofit coordinator would advance that to a far more in-depth, sort of, we're talking here about installing permanent sensors and detailed monitoring. It's going to get really into the guts of it. It's a pretty unpleasant process. We want to avoid that wherever we possibly can, and a good robust process like PAS 2035 will help us to do that. Okay, so just to finish off, I'll introduce you to some contracting models that we've developed that may be of interest to you. There is a guide on our website. The link is there. Now, there are 4 key models. The first is called MACE, which stands for Managed Assessment, Coordination and Evaluation. And this model is really about separating out the installation and the design from the assessment and coordination, and ultimately the evaluation. That means that we can have somebody independent do those bits up front, determine what is the appropriate thing to do, a contractor to be brought in to do the design and the build and the install, and then the coordinator to come back at the end and ensure that that's all delivered as it should have done. We think this is a really good model for LAD schemes and SHDF, and certainly one that we're doing a lot of piloting around, and we will share the results of that piloting through the SHRA when we can. The next model is called LACE, which stands for Local Assessment, Coordination and Evaluation. And this is a similar model to the previous one in that design and install is split out from the evaluation and coordination and assessment. The difference here is that rather than bring in a third party to provide this for you, the local authority or the social landlord is conducting this themselves. So it's that in-house retrofit coordination and assessment service. In effect, we would highly recommend this. It means that you really have got people on your side making all the important decisions, and then you've got installers doing what installers do and designers doing what designers do. Slightly more complex model is this one, MACD, stands for Managing Agent with Contractor Design and Installation. This is where a managing agent is brought in to oversee most of the process, apart from the design and the install. It is a common model when you're working with the likes of big contractors and big utility firms, as many of you do, and you know, is something there are inherent conflicts of interest in there, but you should be used to managing those by now. And then our final model, contractor-led turnkey retrofit, is where the installer themselves is essentially providing all of those managed services, all of the assessment, all the coordination, and delivering the install. As I said earlier, PAS does allow for this. It doesn't say don't do it, but it does require all those conflicts of interest to be declared. So I hope that's been a helpful guide for you. There is far more guidance available from the Retrofit Academy and from other sources. These guides are available to download from our website homepage. PAS 2035 itself is available to buy from the BSI bookstore. Strongly recommend that you do get hold of a copy of that if you're going to be managing large numbers of PAS 2035 compliant projects. It's not as bad a read as people suggest. For more information about the SHRA, those are the contact details. So thank you very much for listening, and do get in touch if you have any questions.